I remember that night vividly, though at the time I didn't realize just how much it would matter. My name's Roman Conway, and I've spent most of my adult life as a paramedic, racing through streets to save lives. I'm the guy who runs toward the chaos, who holds shattered bodies together until they reach the ER. I've been doing it for almost 15 years now. Seen things most people couldn't stomach: children dying, hopeless wrecks, violence. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the slow-motion disaster of my own life, unraveling right before my eyes. Let me backtrack a bit. Cassandra Cassie, as I used to call her, was the love of my life, or at least I thought she was. We met when I was just a rookie paramedic, fresh out of training. She was working at the hospital's pharmacy back then, doing something fancy with prescriptions. What stood out about her wasn't just her beauty, though she had that in spades: long brown hair that cascaded down her back, sharp green eyes that always seemed to be analyzing everything around her, but the way she was, cool, in control. Cassie never let anything rattle her, and that's what hooked me. I'd come off shift soaked in blood, hands still shaking from adrenaline, and there she'd be calm, composed, with just the right amount of sarcasm to keep me grounded. We got married a few years later. No kids. Neither of us wanted them, and we were happy with our fast-paced lives, long shifts, and those sweet, stolen moments between work. At least, I thought we were happy. The thing is, I never saw it coming. Looking back, there were signs. Little ones, like the way she started spending more time at the pharmacy, even when she wasn't working, or how she'd blow off our plans to stay late for some inventory issue. At the time, I chalked it up to the stress of her job. Healthcare's no joke. But as the months rolled on, the cracks started showing. She became distant. Her mind always seemed elsewhere when we were together. Our sex life, once vibrant, was now a distant memory. But when you're saving lives every day, it's easy to ignore the signals flashing right in front of your face. I first started getting suspicious when I noticed the withdrawals. Cassie and I had a joint account, something we'd set up early in the marriage because, well, we trusted each other. But last summer, I noticed a few transactions that didn't add up. At first, they were small: $50 here, $100 there. Nothing major. I figured she was buying something for herself, maybe treating herself to a spa day or some expensive skincare product. Cassie liked the finer things, even if she wasn't loud about it. But then the withdrawals got bigger. One day, it was $500, the next, a clean grand. I asked her about it once nonchalantly while we were eating dinner. "Hey babe, did we forget about some bills or something? I saw a few big charges on the account this week." She didn't even flinch, just raised an eyebrow and smiled that slow, easy smile of hers. "Oh, that. I've been picking up some gifts for a friend. Nothing to worry about." "A friend, right?" I let it slide because, well, you don't think your wife's cheating on you when you're busy patching up stab victims and delivering babies on the side of the road. You just don't. But the doubts started creeping in. You know that feeling? Like something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. That nagging little itch in the back of your mind. Yeah, I had that. Fast forward a few weeks and things got worse. She started going out more, coming home late, always with an excuse. I was catching up with an old friend, she'd say, or there was a work event. She never smelled like another man or came back disheveled, but her phone was glued to her hand like her life depended on it. Every time it buzzed, she'd snatch it up with a speed I hadn't seen in years. And God help me if I even glanced in the direction of her screen. So then there were the changes in bed. Not that we were doing much anymore, but when we did, it felt different, cold, distant. Like she was somewhere else, her mind off in some other world where I didn't exist. The doubts started piling up, and being a paramedic, you learn to trust your gut. My gut was screaming that something was off. But how do you confront your wife of 10 years with "I think you're screwing around"? It's not like I could just ask her. I needed proof. So one day while Cassie was at work, I set up some hidden cameras around the house. I wasn't proud of it, but at this point I was desperate. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted those cameras to catch nothing but her coming home, tired from a long day, and me being the paranoid asshole. But that wasn't what happened. And now here I am, sitting in the aftermath, wondering how I didn't see it coming. I'll never forget the night the shit hit the fan. I was working a long shift, the kind that leaves you feeling more dead than alive. Around midnight, we got a call about a nasty pileup on the highway. It was one of those calls where you're already exhausted, but the adrenaline kicks in because you know it's bad. A pregnant woman was trapped inside one of the wrecks. Her car was mangled beyond recognition, and time was against us. It took over an hour to free her, and when we finally did, she was barely hanging on. We got her to the hospital in time, but by the time I walked through our front door, I was dead on my feet. I just wanted a shower and sleep. But instead, I found something else. Cassie wasn't home. She had left a note on the kitchen counter Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Another late night? At this point, I wasn't even surprised. What did surprise me was the bank alert that popped up on my phone an hour later. Another $1,500 withdrawn from the account. I stared at my phone, the damn notification glaring back at me like a neon sign. $1,500 gone just like that. What kind of gift for a friend cost that much? And why the hell was she withdrawing cash like we were trying to avoid the IRS? Cassie wasn't answering her phone, no surprise there, but I was too tired to fight that battle. So I showered, scrubbed off the highway grime, and collapsed into bed. I wanted to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. That feeling, that itch, was back. Stronger this time. Something wasn't right, and I needed to figure out what. The next morning, I woke up to find her already gone. Her side of the bed was barely disturbed, like she'd just slipped out in the early hours. A quick check of the cameras I'd installed didn't show much. She had come home around 3 a.m. and left before dawn. I watched the footage with a knot in my stomach. She didn't seem drunk, high, or even particularly out of it, just distant, mechanical. As I ate breakfast, I tried to recall the Cassie I used to know. The woman who would sneak into bed after my shifts, wrap her arms around me, and kiss my neck while I pretended to sleep. We'd been married for nearly a decade, but it felt like a lifetime since those days. Somewhere along the line we'd lost each other, but I couldn't say exactly when or why. It wasn't any one thing, just a slow, steady drift apart. My job had a lot to do with it. Being a paramedic isn't just about saving lives, it's about living the chaos. I'm out there pulling people from wrecks, watching families break down when they realize their loved ones aren't coming home. Cassie didn't get that. She saw the exhaustion, the late nights, the missed dinners, but not the emotional toll. And I didn't talk about it. I never wanted to burden her with the horrors I saw, the nightmares that sometimes followed me home. But she had her own demons too, and I hadn't noticed when they started to eat at her. I finished my coffee and headed out for another shift, pushing everything aside for the moment. I have to when you're in this line of work. You can't be thinking about your marriage falling apart when you've got someone's life in your hands. By the time I got home, Cassie was there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. She looked up when I walked in, offered a half-hearted smile, and went right back to whatever she was reading. We were like two strangers, barely sharing space, and the distance between us felt insurmountable. "How was work?" she asked, not even looking up this time. "It was work," I replied, pulling off my jacket and tossing it on the chair. "Yours?" "Fine. Just busy, you know. Inventory stuff. The same damn excuse. Every single time." I stood there for a moment, watching her, waiting for something, anything that might make this feel normal again. But it never came. Instead, we just went through the motions like we had 1,000 times before. Dinner was silent, awkward. She was glued to her phone, checking it every few seconds like she was waiting for something or someone. Later, as she headed to bed, I stayed back, pretending to finish up some work on my laptop, but really, I just needed to think. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop that night. She'd glance at it, her face blank, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the device. I was done pretending this was all in my head. So at night, after she'd fallen asleep, I grabbed her phone. It wasn't locked. Cassie never felt the need for that kind of privacy, so it was easy enough to scroll through her messages. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't much. Maybe a few flirty texts with someone I didn't recognize. Hell, I thought maybe she was blowing money on shopping, but what I found was far worse. A name kept popping up. Lewis. Over and over, there were messages exchanged at all hours. At first, they seemed innocent enough, work-related, short, polite. But as I scrolled back through the weeks, the messages changed. Their tone shifted from professional to personal. It was subtle at first, but it grew bolder. Words like "miss you" and "can't wait to see you again" littered their exchanges. My stomach churned as I read them. I couldn't stop myself. I kept going, kept digging through every message, trying to pinpoint the exact moment this had started. Somewhere in the blur of texts, I found what I was looking for, or at least the beginning of it. Lewis wasn't just some colleague. He was a pharmacist at the hospital, someone she worked closely with. The more I read, the more it became clear that this wasn't just an emotional affair either. There were references to dinners, long nights together, even an out-of-town trip that I thought had been for a conference. I had no idea how long this had been going on, but from what I could gather, it was months. And here I was, thinking we were just in a rut, that our sex life had taken a back seat because of work. I had no idea she was sneaking around with this guy, this Lewis, while I was out there busting my ass, literally saving lives. The worst part, I still wanted to be wrong. As much as the evidence was right there in front of me, clear as day, I needed more. I couldn't confront her with just these texts. She'd deny it, make up some excuse. No, I needed something concrete, something that would rip this whole thing wide open. So I waited, played the part of the oblivious husband while my mind raced, trying to piece together what my next move should be. Cassie carried on like nothing had changed. She kissed me goodbye in the mornings, said she loved me before heading off to work. It was all a lie, and now I knew it. A week later, I was sitting in my car, parked down the street from the pharmacy. I had timed my day to finish a little early, leaving work without telling Cassie. I needed to see it for myself, see them together. Face to face. There was a nagging part of me that still hoped maybe I was wrong, that the messages were just a misunderstanding, but deep down I knew. I watched the front doors of the pharmacy like a hawk, my heart pounding in my chest as the minutes dragged on. Finally, just as the sun began to set, I saw them, Cassie and Lewis, walking out together. They weren't holding hands, they didn't kiss. But the way they walked so closely, the way they glanced at each other, it told me everything I needed to know. They got into his car, her hand brushing against his as she opened the door, and drove off together. It felt like a punch to the gut. This was real. My wife, the woman I'd spent 10 years of my life with, was cheating on me, and not just once. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was planned, it was deliberate. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't follow them. There was no point. I knew what was happening. I couldn't go on pretending. Not anymore. Once you've seen it, once you've witnessed the lie up close, there's no unseeing it. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Cassie, her body warm under the blankets, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beside her. The smell of her perfume, once something I'd loved, now made me sick. I stared at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess of anger, disbelief, and something much darker, a desire for revenge. But no, I wouldn't give in to that. I wasn't going to be the guy who flies off the handle. I was going to be smart about this, precise. She thought she was playing me, but I was about to flip the script. The next morning, everything seemed painfully normal. Cassie kissed me on the cheek as she left for work, her lips lingering just a second too long, like she knew she needed to keep up appearances. But now I saw through it all. Every touch, every word, it was all fake. It made me want to rip my own skin off just to escape the suffocating weight of it. I spent the day off duty, making calls and pulling some strings. I had a few friends in tech who owed me favors. By the afternoon, my plan was in motion. Hidden cameras, real ones this time, not just in the living room. I had them installed in places she wouldn't even think to check: our bedroom, the kitchen, even the hallway leading to the front door. If Cassie thought she could sneak around behind my back, she had another thing coming. For the next week, I waited. I pretended everything was fine, even though it felt like every conversation we had was drenched in lies. She didn't seem to suspect anything. She kept going to work, kept coming home late with the same tired excuses about inventory, or just grabbing a drink with some co-workers. But I knew better now. I had the footage. All I needed was for her to slip up one more time. And then she did. It was a Friday night. I'd just finished another grueling shift, another car accident. This one involving a father and his teenage son. The boy hadn't made it, and I was still feeling the weight of that loss as I walked through my front door. Cassie wasn't home. She had left a note on the counter late night at the pharmacy. "Don't wait up." The second I saw it, I knew she was with him. I turned on the monitors connected to the cameras I'd installed, pulling up the live feed. At first, there was nothing. Just the quiet emptiness of our house, illuminated only by the soft glow of the lamps I'd left on. But then, around 10, I saw it, Cassie walking through the front door, and right behind her was Lewis. My chest tightened. There was no mistaking what was about to happen. I watched, frozen, as they made their way into the kitchen. She poured them both a glass of wine, laughing softly at something he said. It was so casual, so intimate. This wasn't some fling. They were comfortable with each other in a way that twisted my stomach into knots. She didn't even look nervous. Hell, she seemed relaxed, like this was something they'd done 100 times before. They talked for a few minutes, but I wasn't listening. My eyes were glued to the screen, waiting for the moment that would confirm everything, and it came quickly. She leaned in, kissed him softly at first, then deeper. He pulled her closer, his hands wandering up her body, and then they were heading toward the bedroom. They tried to praise them. I should have looked away. I should have turned the screen off and spared myself the agony. But I didn't. I needed to see it. I needed to burn the image into my brain so that I'd never forget who she really was. And that's exactly what happened. The cameras caught everything. Every kiss, every touch, every breathless moment as they undressed each other, as they climbed into our bed. The bed where we'd once shared our most intimate moments. They didn't even have the decency to do it somewhere else. It was a direct violation of everything we had built, of every ounce of trust I'd ever placed in her. They had sex for nearly an hour, and all the while I watched my heart pounding in my chest, my hands clenched into fists so tight I thought my bones might break. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to drive straight over to Lewis's house and tear him apart. But instead, I just sat there, letting the pain wash over me like a tidal wave, because I knew this was only the beginning. When it was over, they stayed in bed, laughing softly, like nothing was wrong. She rested her head on his chest, tracing lazy circles on his skin with her fingers, and I realized just how deep this betrayal went. This wasn't just sex. This was something much worse. Eventually, Lewis left, kissing her goodbye before slipping out the door. Cassie didn't stay up long after that. She showered, washed him off of her like it was nothing, and then climbed into bed, in the same sheets she'd just ruined with him. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my car, parked a few blocks away, staring out at the darkened street, wondering how the hell I was supposed to face her the next morning. The next day, I didn't say a word. I went through the motions, pretending like I hadn't seen everything. It was like I was living in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I made her coffee, kissed her goodbye as she left for work, and then I started planning my next move. I knew confronting her wasn't enough. Cassie wasn't just having an affair, she was living an entirely separate life with this guy, and I wasn't about to just roll over and let it happen. But I needed more than just my own anger. I needed hard evidence, something that couldn't be explained away with a tearful apology or some half-assed excuse. So I took everything. The footage from the cameras, the text messages, the bank withdrawals, it was all neatly organized into a folder. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet, but I had a feeling that time would come soon enough, and I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, I was finishing up my shift when one of the nurses pulled me aside. "Hi, Roman, you got a second?" I followed her into the break room, still wearing my blood-stained scrubs, and found a guy waiting there. I recognized him immediately, Lewis. He wasn't wearing his white coat today. Instead, he looked like a regular guy, in jeans and a shirt, but the smug look on his face told me this wasn't a friendly visit. "I need to talk to you," Lewis said, his voice low and serious. The break room was empty, save for the three of us. I folded my arms, waiting. I wasn't about to make this easy for him to talk. He looked at the nurse, and she quickly excused herself, leaving us alone. The second the door closed, Lewis took a deep breath and spoke. "Roman, I think you should know, Cassie and we're together. It's been going on for a while." My blood went cold, but I kept my face neutral. "And you're telling me this why?" "Because it's serious. I'm in love with her, and she's in love with me." He smiled, like he thought I might actually be happy for him. "I wanted to be the one to tell you. You deserve to hear it from me, man to man." It took everything in me not to lunge at him right then and there. But instead, I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "That's real noble of you, Lewis." He didn't get it. The guy actually thought I was going to thank him. "We're not here to hurt you," he continued, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Cassie doesn't want to hurt you. She's just not happy anymore. She wants a different life." I nodded, pretending to listen. But in my head, I was already 1,000 miles ahead of him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "And one more thing," he added, as if it were a casual afterthought. "Cassie and I were going to start a family." I blinked, the words hanging in the air like a lead weight. "A family? You're not her first choice," he said, his voice lowering even further. "You never were, and soon enough, she's going to make that clear to you. It's better if you just let her go. Let her go. Not a chance." That night, I packed my things. Cassie came home to find the closet half empty and my bags by the door. She stared at me, wide-eyed, the mask she'd been wearing for months finally starting to crack. "Roman, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. And all I saw was a stranger. "Yeah, you are what's going on," I said, my voice cold. "And I'm done playing the fool." Before she could say anything else, I walked out the door. Walking out that door felt like freedom and failure, all at once. Freedom from the lie I'd been living with Cassie, and failure, because no matter what I told myself, the sting of betrayal was still fresh, burning deep inside me. I didn't look back as I tossed my bags into the trunk and drove off. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house a second longer. Every corner of it held a piece of the life we'd built together, the life she'd destroyed with Lewis. I ended up crashing at a buddy's place for a few nights. Adam, another paramedic who'd seen more than his fair share of shit, didn't ask questions when I showed up at his door with a bag in hand. He knew better. We didn't talk about it, at least not right away. Instead, we drank beer, watched reruns of crappy TV shows, and let the silence fill the space between us. It was the kind of support only another paramedic could give, unspoken but steady. Eventually, though, I had to face the mess that was waiting for me. Cassie had called a dozen times that first night, then switched to texts when I didn't pick up. She started off concerned, then angry, and finally turned into pleading. She was spinning out, and part of me enjoyed seeing her panic. It meant I still had control, at least for a little while. But I wasn't interested in talking to her. Not yet. I had a plan, and the next step was making sure it wasn't just a gut punch to her, but a knockout blow. First thing Monday morning, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. Samantha Calloway, divorce attorney and self-proclaimed bulldog in the courtroom, came highly recommended. As soon as I walked into her office, I knew I was in good hands. Samantha was sharp, her eyes cold and calculating, and she didn't waste time sugarcoating anything. "Let me guess," she said as I sat down. "Cheating wife?" "Something like that," I replied, handing over the file of evidence I'd been collecting. The text messages, the hidden camera footage, the bank statements, it was all there, laid out in neat order. She flipped through it, her expression unreadable as she scanned the pages. When she looked up, there was a glint in her eye. "And this is good, really good. We can work with this." I nodded, feeling a surge of vindication. Finally, things were starting to move in my direction, but I wasn't naive. I knew this was just the beginning. Cassie wasn't going to take this lying down, and I had no idea what kind of tricks Lewis had up his sleeve either. They were both too arrogant to let me walk away easily. "What do you want out of this?" Samantha asked, leaning back in her chair. "I want her out of my life," I said, my voice harder than I expected. "And I want her to pay for what she did." She smiled, a cold, calculating smile that told me I'd come to the right person, and we can make that happen. But be prepared, this is going to get ugly. Cassie didn't take long to retaliate. Within days of filing for divorce, I got served with papers of my own. She was fighting back, claiming half of everything, our savings, the house, the investments. She even had the nerve to demand spousal support, arguing that her emotional distress from our failing marriage had left her unable to work at full capacity. I laughed when I read that part. Emotional distress? She had some nerve. But it wasn't just the divorce she was pushing. No, Cassie and Lewis had decided to take it a step further. A few weeks after I moved out, I started hearing rumors at work, whispers in the hallways, side-eye glances from the nurses. At first, I brushed it off. People gossip. It's what they do. But when the rumors started getting more specific about missing medications, unaccounted for drugs, I realized something bigger was going on. Then it hit me. Lewis was a pharmacist. He had access to all sorts of medications, and if he wanted to, he could easily manipulate records to make it look like I was involved in something shady. I confronted the head nurse one night after my shift, catching her as she was packing up for the day. "What's this I'm hearing about missing drugs?" She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, Roman, it's not coming from us, but there's been talk about you, about some discrepancies with the meds you've been handling." I felt the anger bubbling up inside me. "That's bullshit, and you know it." She nodded quickly, sensing my frustration. "I know. But people are talking, and if it keeps up, the higher-ups are going to start looking into it." I left the hospital that night with my blood boiling. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Lewis was trying to frame me, trying to make me look like the bad guy in all of this. He wanted to ruin my reputation, maybe even cost me my job. It wasn't enough that he'd stolen my wife. Now, he was coming for everything else too. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the next few days laying low, keeping my head down at work and avoiding any confrontations. I needed to be smart about this. I knew Lewis and Cassie were trying to bait me into doing something stupid, something that would prove their point. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Instead, I started digging. I reached out to a few people I trusted, people who knew the ins and outs of the pharmacy and the hospital's drug protocols. If Lewis was messing with records, there had to be a trail. And sure enough, after a few nights of sleepless work, I found it. There were discrepancies in the inventory logs, small ones, things that might have been overlooked if you weren't paying attention, medications that had been marked as disposed of or returned, but were never actually accounted for. And the kicker, they were all meds that had passed through Lewis's hands. I didn't have concrete proof yet, but I had enough to start building my case. I compiled everything I found, every inconsistency, every questionable transaction, and then I made my move. The next time I saw Cassie and Lewis, it wasn't in some dimly lit parking lot or over another awkward dinner. No, this time it was in court. Samantha had warned me it would get ugly, and she wasn't wrong. Cassie had pulled out all the stops, playing the part of the victim, claiming that I had been distant, that I'd prioritized my job over our marriage, that I was the one who had driven her into Lewis's arms. Lewis, for his part, sat there smug as ever, not even bothering to hide his satisfaction. They thought they had me. They thought they were going to walk away with half of everything I'd worked for, maybe even more, but they were wrong. When my lawyer presented the evidence, the camera footage, the texts, the bank records, Cassie's face drained of color. She hadn't expected me to come prepared. She thought I'd just roll over and let them take everything. But this wasn't just about the money or the house. This was about my reputation, my life. You see, and then I dropped the bomb. Samantha pulled out the documentation I'd compiled on Lewis's shady dealings with the medications. The room went silent as the judge flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with every passing second. Cassie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, shooting a glance at Lewis, who suddenly wasn't looking so smug. By the time it was over, they were the ones on the defensive. Lewis was under investigation by the hospital, and Cassie's claims about my supposed neglect had been completely dismantled. I walked out of that courtroom with the upper hand, and while the divorce wasn't final yet, I knew the tide had turned in my favor. But there was one more thing I needed to do. One last piece of the puzzle to put them both in their place. That night, I showed up at the house, our house, or what used to be ours. Cassie had been living there alone since I'd left, but I still had my keys. I let myself in, finding her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone like she'd been expecting me. "What are you doing here, Roman?" she asked, her voice tired, defeated. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I tossed a folder onto the coffee table, watching as her eyes flicked to it, confusion flickering across her face. "What's this?" she asked, hesitating before reaching for it. "Open it," I said, my voice steady. She did. Her hands shook as she flipped through the documents inside, bank statements, photos, even a few notarized witness statements. It was all there. The full picture of what she and Lewis had been up to. "You think you can take me down, Cassie?" I said, stepping closer. "You and Lewis? You thought you could frame me for stealing meds? Think again." She looked up at me, her face pale, her lips trembling. I didn't. Save it, I cut her off. "It's over. You lost." I walked out of that house for the last time, the weight of everything finally lifting off my shoulders. Cassie and Lewis had tried to ruin me, but in the end they were the ones left scrambling to pick up the pieces. The day the divorce was finalized felt like both the end of a long battle and the start of something new. I walked out of the courthouse, the paperwork in hand, and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, I wasn't consumed by rage or bitterness. I was free. Cassie was no longer my wife, no longer my problem, and whatever mess she had made with Lewis, they could deal with it together. They deserved each other. Lewis, I'd heard through the grapevine, wasn't doing so well. The investigation into the missing medications had snowballed, and he was looking at losing his job, maybe even his license. I had no doubt he'd fight it, guys like him always do, but it was out of my hands now. Whatever happened to him was his own doing. As for Cassie, she'd slinked away quietly, barely making eye contact during the last court hearing. I think she finally realized just how deep a hole she'd dug for herself. I wasn't interested in hearing from either of them again. They could rot together for all I cared. But the story wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of my own life, what came next. I'd spent so much time fighting, clawing my way through the wreckage of my marriage, that I hadn't really thought about the future. But now that the dust was settling, I knew I had to start rebuilding. A few weeks after the divorce, something unexpected happened. I was at work, another long shift, this time with an accident on the outskirts of town. It was a nasty one, an overturned semi that had smashed into a minivan. My partner and I were one of the first on the scene, and as we scrambled to get people out, I saw her. It was the pregnant woman. The one I'd saved months ago, during that highway wreck the night that started this whole mess. She was being wheeled out on a stretcher, her face pale but alive. Her baby was alive too. She caught my eye as I passed, and for a moment I thought maybe she recognized me. Maybe she remembered that I had been there, that I had helped save her life. After the chaos died down and the patients were taken to the hospital, I found myself lingering in the emergency room, leaning against the wall and staring at nothing in particular. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was something oddly calming about being back in that space. The hospital had always been a second home to me, even if it had become the backdrop to Cassie's betrayal. But now it felt like a place of healing again. I was about to head out when someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around, and there she was, the pregnant woman from the crash. She was sitting in a wheelchair, holding her newborn baby in her arms, her face filled with a quiet gratitude. "I didn't get to thank you," she said softly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. I blinked, surprised. "For what?" "For saving us," she said, her eyes shining. "That night on the highway. I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for you." I shook my head, feeling uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job." "No," she insisted, her voice stronger now. "You did more than that. You gave me my family back." I looked at the baby in her arms, tiny and perfect, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something warm stir inside me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had done more than just my job that night. We talked for a few minutes, and when I left the hospital that day, something had shifted. I wasn't just Roman Conway, the guy whose wife had cheated on him. I wasn't just a paramedic who pulled people out of wrecks. I was part of something bigger, something that mattered. And that realization gave me the strength I didn't know I needed. A few months later, I was back on my feet, fully immersed in work. My reputation was intact. The rumors about the stolen meds had died down, and life was starting to feel normal again, if a little quieter. I'd moved into a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I spent my days working and my nights figuring out how to live alone again. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be either. So then, out of the blue, I got a call. The paramedics' annual awards ceremony was coming up, and my name had been put forward for one of the top honors. Apparently, my work over the past year, the lives I'd saved, the critical situations I'd handled hadn't gone unnoticed. When the day of the ceremony came, I sat in the audience, not expecting much. I wasn't doing this job for awards. I was doing it because it was all I knew, because it mattered. But when my name was called, and I walked up to that stage to accept the award, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. As I stood there, holding the plaque in my hands, I looked out into the crowd and saw the faces of my co-workers, my friends, the people who had stood by me through everything. Adam, sitting near the front, raised his beer in a silent toast, a grin on his face. I smiled back, feeling more like myself than I had in months. I gave a short speech, nothing too fancy, just a thank you to the people who had supported me, to the profession that had given me a purpose. But as I spoke, I realized something important. I wasn't just moving on from Cassie and Lewis, I was moving forward, towards something better. The weeks that followed were a blur of normalcy shifts at the hospital, grabbing drinks with Adam, slowly building my life back up piece by piece. But there was one night that stood out. I was sitting in a small diner, the kind that stays open all night, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the world go by. It had been a quiet evening, and I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the anger, the fight to keep my life together. It all felt like a distant memory now, something that had happened to someone else. Then the door chimed, and a woman walked in. She was tall, with long dark hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to see everything. She glanced around the diner, spotted an empty booth near the back, and made her way over. As she passed by my table, our eyes met briefly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something hope. She smiled, just a small, polite smile, before sliding into her seat and pulling out a book. But that smile lingered in my mind, even after I left the diner that night. Maybe, just maybe, life was starting to turn around.